My brother embezzled our mother's memorial scholarship fund. 2 years after our mother died, I discovered that the scholarship fund we'd built in her memory, the one my brother had been running as executive director since its founding, had given out exactly one scholarship in 18 months and paid my brother a 6-figure salary to do it. Our mother, Marisol, taught high school chemistry for 31 years in the same small district where she'd grown up herself, and she had a particular fierce dedication to a specific kind of student, the ones who were smart enough to go somewhere, university, a real career, a life bigger than the one their circumstances seemed to have mapped out for them, but who didn't have the money or the family support to actually make that leap without help. She kept a running list, over the decades, of students she'd personally helped find scholarships, wrote recommendation letters for on her own time, sometimes quietly covered application fees for out of her own modest teacher's salary when she knew a family couldn't afford them. She used to say that talent without opportunity was just a wasted resource sitting in a classroom, and that noticing which kids had both and needed only the second one was, in her mind, the most important part of her entire job. She was diagnosed with ovarian cancer 18 months before she died, and in the last year of her life, once treatment options had narrowed to the point where she and her oncologist both understood what was actually happening, she started talking, more and more, about wanting to leave something behind that would keep doing the specific work she'd spent her career doing informally, one student at a time, in a way that could outlast her. My brother Callahan, 3 years older than me, had built a successful career in nonprofit management by then, having spent nearly a decade working for various educational foundations and advocacy organizations, and it seemed, at the time, like an almost perfect fit. Our mother's vision, our brother's professional expertise, a scholarship fund that could formalize and expand exactly the kind of quiet, individual generosity she'd practiced her whole life. I remember specifically a student named Ferris Duarte, who our mother mentioned to me more than once over the years, a boy in her chemistry class in the early 2000s, whose family had been on the edge of losing their apartment the same semester he'd scored high enough on a placement exam to qualify for an accelerated summer program at a state university, a program that would have changed the entire trajectory of his life if his family could have afforded the modest but, for them, insurmountable fee. Our mother had quietly covered that fee herself, out of a teacher's salary that left very little room for that kind of generosity, and had never told Ferris where the money actually came from, letting him believe for years that he'd simply won some obscure scholarship he'd never fully understood the mechanics of. She told me that story more than once, always with the same specific satisfaction in her voice, the satisfaction of someone who'd solved a problem quietly and completely, and never needed credit for having done it. Ferris went on to become an engineer, sent our mother a card every single Christmas for the rest of her life, never knowing, as far as I ever learned, exactly what she'd done for him at 17. The Marisol Vance Memorial Scholarship Fund was formally established 4 months before our mother died, with her full involvement in shaping its mission and initial structure during the last stretch of her life when she still had the energy for it. Callahan handled the legal formation, the nonprofit registration, the initial fundraising strategy, all the technical machinery neither our mother nor I understood well enough to build ourselves. I remember sitting with her in the hospital, going over draft language for the fund's mission statement, watching her genuine, quiet joy at the idea that something real and lasting might grow out of the specific, individual attention she'd given so many students over so many years. She died 3 weeks after the fund's official launch, having lived just long enough to see the first modest wave of donations come in from former students, colleagues, and community members who remembered her specific, fierce belief in exactly the kind of kid the fund was meant to help. Callahan became the fund's executive director as a natural, unquestioned extension of his role in setting it up, and for the first year, from everything I understood and everything the fund's public updates suggested, things seemed to be going reasonably well. The fund awarded 3 scholarships that first year, modest amounts, a few $1,000s each, enough to make a real difference for a student choosing between community college and a 4-year university, or between working full-time during school and being able to actually focus on their studies. I attended the small award ceremony for that first cohort, held in the same high school gymnasium where our mother had taught for 3 decades, and I remember watching 3 nervous, excited teenagers accept certificates and small checks, that we genuinely built something she would have loved. I want to be clear, the same way it's mattered in every account, like this one I've come to understand others have lived through. This isn't a story about a brother who was calculating from the very beginning. Callahan cried at that first award ceremony, visibly, genuinely, the specific kind of crying that happens when grief and pride collide unexpectedly in the same moment. Whatever came later, I don't believe that first year's genuine effort was performance. I served on the fund's small volunteer board alongside Callahan and 2 of our mother's former teaching colleagues, a structure our mother had specifically wanted, believing that people who'd actually known the students and the community firsthand should have real say in how the fund operated, rather than leaving everything entirely in the hands of paid nonprofit professionals, no matter how well-intentioned. But I'll be honest about something that matters to understanding what happened. My role on that board was, for most of its first 2 years, largely passive. Callahan handled the fund's day-to-day operations, its finances, its grant-making decisions with a professional competence that made me feel as as someone with no nonprofit management background myself, that second-guessing his judgment on anything would be both unhelpful and faintly insulting to someone who genuinely knew this work far better than I did. Our mother's two former colleagues on the board, both retired by then, deferred to him similarly, trusting his professional expertise the same way I did. It was nearly 2 years after our mother's death, at what should have been a routine board meeting to review the fund's annual filings before submitting them to the state's nonprofit oversight office, that I finally looked closely enough at the actual numbers to understand something was badly wrong. I'd asked, ahead of that meeting, for the fund's complete financial summary from its second fiscal year, mostly out of a vague, nagging sense that I should probably start paying closer attention to my board responsibilities rather than any specific suspicion. Callahan sent over a summary document a few days before the meeting, professionally formatted, full of the kind of nonprofit financial terminology that had always made my eyes glaze over slightly during our brief board discussions. I sat down with it one evening, determined for once to actually read through it carefully rather than skimming it and trusting the totals at the bottom, and what I found made my stomach drop in a way that took me a full minute to fully process. The fund's total revenue for that second year, between ongoing donations and a modest endowment our mother's life insurance had partially seeded, came to just under $300,000. Of that, scholarship awards to actual students totaled $8,000, a single scholarship, given to one student that entire year, down from 3 the year before. Everything else, the remaining bulk of nearly $300,000, had gone toward what the document categorized, in careful professional nonprofit language, as administrative and operational expenses, a category that included, I discovered when I dug into the detailed breakdown attached as an appendix, a 6-figure executive director salary for Callahan himself, along with office rent for a space I'd never actually visited or heard mentioned, consulting fees paid to a firm I didn't recognize, and a range of other expenses that, taken together, consumed nearly the entire fund's operating budget, while leaving almost nothing for the actual scholarships the fund existed to provide. I called Callahan immediately, my voice climbing into a register I didn't fully recognize as my own, and asked him to explain how a fund our mother had built specifically to help students had somehow spent nearly 97% of its revenue on everything except students. He responded in a tone that had gone carefully measured in a way I'd never heard him use with me before, that nonprofit startups typically required significant investment in infrastructure and operational capacity during their early years before scholarship distributions could scale up meaningfully, that his salary reflected fair market compensation for someone with his professional experience running a legitimate nonprofit organization, and that the administrative expense ratio I was reacting to, while admittedly higher than industry best practices recommended, wasn't inherently improper or unusual for a young organization still building its fundraising infrastructure. I didn't fully believe that explanation even as he was delivering it, mostly because of a detail that kept nagging at me the entire time he spoke. The fund's first year, under his same leadership, had managed to award 3 scholarships totaling nearly $15,000, while spending considerably less on administrative overhead. According to the prior year's filing, I pulled up on my laptop while we were still on the phone. Whatever had changed between year 1 and year 2 hadn't been some gradual, explicable scaling of infrastructure. It had been a sudden, dramatic shift in where the money actually went. The weeks that followed were a slow, sickening unraveling of things I'd taken entirely on faith for 2 years, without ever examining closely. I requested access to the fund's complete financial records, going back to its founding, and found myself met with a series of delays. Callahan needed time to compile everything properly, some records were with the fund's accountant, and would take a few days to retrieve. A request that seemed reasonable on its own, but that, stacked week after week with no actual records materializing, began to feel like something closer to stalling. I reached out to the office space listed in the fund's expense breakdown, a small suite in a business park I'd never once visited despite serving on the board for 2 years, and learned from the building's leasing office that the space had indeed been leased under the fund's name, but that the lease had only technically required Callahan's physical presence a handful of days each month, with most of the space's actual daily use, according to the building manager who mentioned it almost in passing. Coming from what appeared to be an entirely separate consulting business, Callahan seemed to be running out of the same office. I reached out to the consulting firm listed in the expense report, a company called Ashgrove Strategic Partners, and found, after some searching, that it was registered to an address that traced back through public business filings to Callahan's own home address, under a name that wasn't quite his but was close enough, a registered trade name, I'd later learn, that allowed him to legally operate a private consulting business while obscuring the direct connection to his own name in casual searches. I brought everything I'd found to Odalie's kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, both of us sitting with the printed financial summary spread out between us, the way we might once have graded papers together back when I was a student in her own classroom decades before any of this happened. She read through it slowly, twice, and when she finally looked up, her expression carried a specific, weary recognition that told me, before she'd said a word, that I wasn't the first person in that room to have noticed something was wrong. Odalie Ferrand, one of our mother's former former teaching colleagues on the board who'd known both Callahan and me since we were children sitting in her classroom decades earlier, listened to the whole account with a growing visible alarm, and admitted once I'd finished that she'd had her own quiet, nagging discomfort about the fund's direction over the past year, small things she'd noticed but hadn't felt equipped or confident enough to raise formally, deferring the way I had to Callahan's professional expertise rather than trusting her own instincts. She mentioned specifically that Callahan had stopped sending the detailed monthly updates he'd faithfully provided during the fund's first year, replacing them, sometime around the 6-month mark of year 2, with brief, vague quarterly summaries that emphasized operational milestones and capacity building, without ever quite specifying how many students had actually received help. I told myself he was just busy, Odalie said. I told myself the same thing you probably told yourself. It's an uncomfortable thing to realize how easy it was for both of us to accept an explanation just because it sounded professional enough. It was Odalie who suggested we needed someone with actual forensic nonprofit accounting experience to properly examine what we were looking at, rather than continuing to try to make sense of it ourselves through untrained eyes. She reached out to a former student of hers, now a certified public accountant specializing in nonprofit compliance, a careful, precise woman named Perpetua Achebe, who agreed to review the fund's available records as a favor to her former teacher, understanding the personal weight the situation carried for everyone involved. Perpetua's initial review, conducted over roughly 3 weeks working from whatever partial records Callahan had eventually, reluctantly provided, revealed a pattern more troubling than even my own untrained read had suggested. Beyond the 6-figure salary and the questionable consulting fees paid to what appeared to be Callahan's own shell business, she identified a series of expense reimbursements, travel, meals, professional development conferences that lacked the kind of documentation any properly run nonprofit would typically require, along with at least 2 instances of donor funds that appeared to have been designated by donors specifically for scholarship distributions, but had instead been folded into the fund's general operating account, where they'd subsequently been spent on the same administrative and consulting expenses as everything else. This isn't just poor management, Perpetua told me, laying out her findings across a conference table at her small office. Poor management looks like inefficiency, waste, maybe some genuinely defensible but questionable judgment calls about overhead spending during a startup phase. What I'm looking at here looks like a deliberate pattern of self-dealing, funneling nonprofit funds toward the executive director's personal financial benefit through a shell consulting arrangement, combined with misdirecting donor-restricted funds away from their specified purpose. Both of those things, depending on how a state attorney general's charity oversight office chooses to characterize them, can constitute serious violations of nonprofit fiduciary law, potentially criminal ones. I sat with that assessment for a long time after Perpetua delivered it, turning over the strange, awful weight of understanding that my own brother had apparently built an elaborate financial structure specifically designed to extract money from a fund built in our mother's memory, using the exact kind of professional-sounding language and technical complexity that had kept me and our mother's 2 former colleagues from ever questioning it closely enough to catch it sooner. I called my closest friend Marisol, a coincidence of names with our mother that had always made her feel, in some small way, like family before any of this even happened, that same night, and found myself unable to get through the story without breaking down completely partway through. She drove over without asking whether I wanted her to, sat with me on my kitchen floor for hours while I alternated between numb disbelief and sharp, sudden waves of anger, and didn't try even once to offer easy reassurance or a tidy explanation for how I should be feeling. She just stayed, the way I imagine the best friends always stay, present without demanding anything in return, until I finally had the strength to start thinking clearly about what came next, rather than simply sitting inside the shock of what I'd just learned. It was Perpetua, in the course of her broader research into nonprofit compliance patterns, who stumbled onto something that widened the scope of what we were dealing with considerably. She mentioned carefully that Callahan's professional history in nonprofit management, which I'd always understood simply as a successful decade-long career across several respected organizations, included a somewhat abrupt departure from his previous position at a different educational foundation roughly 3 years before our mother's fund was established, a departure that, according to public tax filings from that organization, had coincided with a notable unexplained dip in the Gower Foundation's program spending during his final year there, followed by his quiet resignation and a public statement from the foundation's board, thanking him for his service in language Perpetua described as notably generic, the kind organizations use when they want a departure handled quietly rather than publicly. Faustina's number came through an old professional directory Perpetua still had access to from her own nonprofit consulting work, and I remember sitting in my car in a grocery store parking lot before I finally worked up the nerve to call, rehearsing in my head how I might explain to a total stranger that I suspected her old board and mine had both been quietly defrauded by the same man years apart. She answered cautiously, the specific caution I'd come to recognize, by that point, as the sound of someone who'd learned the hard way that raising concerns about a well-liked colleague rarely went the way you hoped it would. Perpetua helped me track down that former board member from Callahan's earlier foundation, a woman named Faustina Okonkwo, who'd since moved on to other nonprofit nonprofit work herself, and who agreed to speak with me once I explained the situation and the striking similarity to what her own board had apparently experienced years earlier. Her account, once she started giving it, matched what Perpetua and I had uncovered about Callahan's fund in a way that made my stomach turn all over again. Faustina described a nearly identical pattern from her own board's experience. Callahan, in his role as a senior program director rather than executive director at that earlier organization, had gradually redirected an increasing share of program funding toward consulting arrangements and administrative expenses that, in retrospect, she and a few other board members had come to suspect benefited him personally, though the foundation's board at the time had never conducted the kind of forensic review that would have definitively proven it, choosing instead to quietly negotiate his departure and move on, rather than pursue a costly, reputation-damaging formal investigation. We suspected something wasn't right, Faustina told me, but proving it felt like it would cost more in time and money and organizational reputation than simply letting him leave quietly and hoping he didn't do it again somewhere else. I've thought about that decision many times since, wondering whether staying quiet just meant he found somewhere new to try the same thing. I'm sorry to say, hearing your story, that it sounds like that's exactly what happened. With Perpetua's forensic findings and Faustina's account of the earlier, unresolved pattern now assembled into something far more substantial than my own initial suspicion, Odali and I brought everything to a nonprofit governance attorney recommended by Perpetua, a precise, formidable woman named Thesali Okonkwo, no relation to Faustina, a coincidence of surnames Perpetua found more amusing than either Odali or I did, given how tired we both were of encountering strangers who shared names, with people already tangled up in this case, who specialized specifically in nonprofit board fiduciary disputes, and had handled several prior cases involving executive directors who'd exploited exactly the kind of trusting, under-resourced volunteer board structure our mother's fund had relied on. Thessalie's first move was procedural, but critical. She explained that as board members, Odali, our mother's other former colleague, and I collectively held both the authority and the fiduciary obligation to formally suspend Callahan's executive authority pending a full investigation, a step she recommended taking immediately before he had any further opportunity to access fund accounts or destroy remaining records. This was, without question, the hardest practical step of the entire process for me personally, formally voting, alongside two women who'd taught both Callahan and me as children, to strip my own brother of the role he'd held since before our mother's death, based on evidence that still felt, even with Perpetua's forensic findings in hand, somehow unreal to actually be voting on. Thesalie's second move was engaging a full forensic accounting review beyond what Perpetua had been able to accomplish as an informal favor, bringing in a colleague of Perpetua's who specialized specifically in nonprofit fraud investigation for the state's own regulatory purposes. A methodical, exacting man named Basil Renner, who conducted a complete audit of every transaction the fund had processed since its founding, cross-referencing bank records, the Shell Consulting Company's own filings, and every donor communication the fund had ever sent regarding how contributions would be used. Basil worked in a small office cluttered with the same kind of case files Odali's earlier professional referrals had led me to expect from people in his line of work, folders stacked in neat, labeled rows representing years of other families and organizations' worst financial betrayals. He explained his methodology to us before he began, told us that a proper forensic audit meant reconstructing every dollar's actual path, rather than simply trusting the categories a set of books claimed to represent, cross-referencing bank statements against invoices against donor correspondence until every discrepancy either resolved into an innocent explanation or hardened into something that couldn't be explained away at all. Basil's full audit, completed over nearly 2 months, painted a picture more damning than even Perpetua's preliminary findings had suggested. The total amount diverted from the fund's intended scholarship purpose toward Callahan's personal financial benefit through the combination of an inflated salary inconsistent with comparable organizations of similar size, questionable consulting fees paid to his own shell company, and misdirected restricted donor funds, came to just over $240,000 across the fund's 2 years of operation, nearly the entirety of what our mother's memory had raised, diverted away from the students it was meant to help and into her own son's personal accounts. Thesalie's strategy, once Basil's audit was complete, involved 2 parallel tracks she explained carefully before we moved forward with either. The first was a formal referral to the State Attorney General's Charitable Organizations Oversight Division, which had legal authority to investigate nonprofit fiduciary violations and, in cases involving this scale of diverted funds, potential criminal referral for embezzlement. The second was a civil demand directed at Callahan himself, seeking full restitution of the diverted funds to the scholarship program, alongside his permanent formal removal from any future role with the organization. Cases like this involving a family member specifically are unusually difficult in one particular way, Thesalie told us during our strategy meeting. The people harmed, the students who never received the scholarships this money should have funded, aren't in this room, aren't the ones pursuing the case directly, which sometimes makes it feel less urgent to families than it actually is. I want you to remember as we move forward that every dollar diverted here is a dollar that should have paid for someone's tuition, someone's someone's textbooks, someone's chance at exactly the kind of opportunity your mother spent her entire career fighting to create. This isn't just a family dispute over money, it's a betrayal of an actual, specific promise made to real students who trusted that promise. We filed the formal complaint with the Attorney General's office the following week, attaching Basil's complete forensic audit, Faustina's sworn account of the earlier, similar pattern at Callahan's previous organization, and a full accounting of the board's own decision-making timeline, from my initial discovery through Callahan's formal suspension. The Attorney General's Charitable Oversight Division confirmed receipt within days and opened a formal investigation, a process Thessaly warned us could take several months to fully resolve, given the office's typically limited staffing relative to the volume of cases it handled. Thessaly spent an evening before the first formal meeting walking the board through what to expect, told us that family cases carried a specific difficulty she'd learned to prepare clients for regardless of how many prior cases she'd handled, that the emotional pull to soften evidence, to look for reasonable doubt where none genuinely existed, ran stronger when the person across the table shared your last name and your childhood memories. The documentation doesn't care how you feel about him, she said. Your job in that room is just to let it speak. You don't have to feel less complicated about him to still do what's right by the students this fund was built for. Callahan retained his own attorney almost immediately once he understood the board had filed a formal complaint, and the resulting series of meetings, spread across nearly 4 months, felt at times like an entirely different, more exhausting kind of grief than anything I'd experienced even in the immediate aftermath of our mother's death. A slow, grinding process of watching my own brother's attorney attempt to minimize and reframe evidence that Basil's forensic audit had documented in exhaustive, unambiguous detail. The first formal meeting, held at Thessaly's office with Callahan and his attorney present alongside the board and our own legal team, began with Callahan's attorney attempting to characterize the entire situation as a series of defensible, if aggressive, executive compensation and business development decisions rather than fraud, arguing that nonprofit executive directors regularly negotiated substantial salaries, that consulting arrangements with outside firms were common practice even when those firms happened to be closely connected to the executive in question, and that the donor-restricted fund misdirection Perpetua and Basil had identified could plausibly be explained by imprecise internal accounting practices rather than deliberate diversion. Thessaly responded to each of these arguments in turn, calmly, methodically, with specific citations to Basil's audit and to the state's own nonprofit compliance statutes, and I watched, over the course of that first grueling meeting, the confidence in Callahan's attorney's presentation visibly erode as it became clear the evidence had been assembled far too thoroughly to survive a strategy of vague, generalized reframing. It was Callahan's attorney who requested the meeting's first recess, roughly 90 minutes in, presumably to have a difficult private conversation with his own client about the actual strength of the position he was defending. I hadn't seen Callahan in person since his formal suspension nearly 3 months earlier, all our subsequent communication having gone through attorneys, and I found myself sitting across the conference table from him during that first meeting, cycling through emotions faster than I could fully process any single one of them. Anger, certainly, but also a strange, unwanted grief for the brother who'd cried genuinely at that first awards ceremony, for the version of him I'd trusted completely. For 2 years, without ever thinking to question the professional competence he'd always projected so convincingly. It was during the second formal meeting, 3 weeks later, once the Attorney General's office had completed enough of its own parallel investigation to formally notify Callahan's attorney that criminal referral was being seriously considered given the scale of documented diversion, that something in Callahan's posture finally shifted. His attorney requested a private conversation with Thessaly and the board before the formal session began, a negotiation I wasn't directly party to, but that O'Dali later described to me in careful detail. And when the full meeting finally convened, Callahan's attorney opened not with further reframing, but with an acknowledgement that his client wished to discuss a comprehensive settlement rather than continuing to contest the underlying findings. It was Callahan himself, not his attorney, who finally spoke at length, in a voice that had lost almost all of the careful, professional composure he'd maintained through our earlier, tenser exchanges. He said the fund's first year had been genuine, that he'd meant every bit of the grief and pride he'd shown at that first ceremony, that something had shifted for him sometime during the transition into the second year, watching donations continue arriving steadily, even as his own personal financial situation, strained by debts from a business venture that had failed years before he'd ever come to work for our mother's fund, had grown increasingly desperate in ways he'd never disclosed to any of us. He said he'd told himself at first that a temporarily inflated salary was simply fair compensation he was owed for genuinely difficult, underappreciated nonprofit work, and that the line between fair compensation and outright theft had blurred for him gradually, one incremental decision at a time, until he'd found himself, nearly 2 years in, having built something that bore almost no resemblance to what our mother had actually wanted, unable to see any clean way back to the person he'd been at that first ceremony. I kept telling myself I'd fix it once I was more financially stable, he said, his voice cracking on the last few words. I told myself the scholarships would come back once the fund had a stronger operational foundation. I don't know anymore whether I ever actually believed that, or just needed to believe it to keep doing doing what I was doing? I asked him directly, the question that had been sitting in my chest through the entire ordeal, one I hadn't planned to ask in that formal setting but couldn't hold back any longer. I asked whether what happened at his previous foundation, the pattern Faustina had described to me, had been the same thing, whether this was truly the second time he'd done this rather than some isolated, unprecedented failure specific to our mother's fund. He was quiet for a long moment, his attorney visibly tensing beside him, before he finally, quietly, admitted that yes, something similar had happened there too, that he'd told himself, leaving that position, that he'd learned his lesson, that he'd never let himself get into that position again. A promise he'd apparently kept for almost 3 years before circumstances and old financial pressure found their way back to him anyway. The settlement Thessaly negotiated over the following weeks required Callahan to formally, permanently resign from any role with the fund, to sign over the remaining assets from his failed consulting business toward restitution, and to enter a structured repayment plan for the substantial remaining balance of the $240,000 Basil's audit had documented as diverted, a plan that Thessaly acknowledged, realistically, would likely take Callahan the better part of a decade to fully satisfy, given his current financial circumstances, but that established a clear, legally enforceable obligation rather than simply writing off the loss entirely. The question of whether to allow the Attorney General's office to proceed with a separate criminal referral, beyond the civil settlement already negotiated, became, once again, the hardest decision the board had to make throughout the entire ordeal, and we spent 3 separate meetings circling it without quite landing anywhere, each conversation surfacing some new angle none of us had fully considered before. O'Dali and our mother's other former colleague, both of whom had known Callahan since childhood the same way they'd known me, felt genuine conflict about pursuing criminal consequences against a former student they still, in some complicated way, cared about despite everything he'd done. Our mother's colleague, a retired math teacher named Cricket Alvarado, who'd taught Callahan geometry decades earlier, said at one of those meetings that she kept picturing the 14-year-old boy who'd once stayed after class 3 days a week just to get extra help with roofs, and finding it almost impossible to hold that image in her mind at the same time as the man Basil's audit had documented. I found myself torn in a different but related way, furious at what he'd done to our mother's memory and to the students who never received the help that money should have provided, but also unable to fully separate that fury from 3 decades of being his younger sister, of remembering him teaching me to ride a bike, of the specific, complicated grief of watching someone you've loved your entire life reveal a capacity for harm you'd never imagined possible. We ultimately decided, after weeks of difficult circling conversation, not unlike the deliberations other families in situations structurally similar to ours have had to work through, to let the Attorney General's office make its own independent determination about criminal referral, declining to either formally request charges or formally request leniency, choosing instead to focus our own energy on the civil restitution and the fund's actual recovery going forward. The Attorney General's office, based on the scale of documented diversion and the pattern Faustina's account had established, ultimately did pursue criminal charges, and Callahan pleaded guilty, roughly a year later, to a felony charge of nonprofit fiduciary fraud, receiving a sentence that included probation, mandatory restitution alongside the civil settlement already in place, and a permanent bar from serving in any nonprofit executive or fiduciary role in the state going forward. O'Dali and I spent nearly a month interviewing nonprofit governance consultants before settling on a small firm that specialized specifically in post-fraud organizational recovery, a niche neither of us had known existed until Thessaly mentioned it. Run by people who'd apparently built entire careers around helping boards like ours rebuild trust and oversight after exactly this kind of betrayal. The lead consultant, a patient, direct woman who spent our first meeting simply listening to the entire story without offering any advice at all, told us afterward that the single most common mistake boards made after discovering fraud was rushing to rebuild too quickly, eager to move past the discomfort rather than sitting with it long enough to actually understand every specific gap in oversight that had allowed it to happen in the first place. We spent 3 full months just mapping every point in the fund's original structure, where a single, trusted individual had held unchecked authority before we ever wrote a single new policy. Rebuilding the fund itself, once Callahan's formal removal was complete, became its own long, careful project. O'Dali stepped into an interim leadership role, and the board, chastened by exactly how thoroughly our collective, well-intentioned trust had been exploited, brought in those outside nonprofit governance consultants to help establish real financial oversight structures, independent audits, multiple signature approval requirements for any expense above a modest threshold, quarterly financial reviews presented in language specifically designed to be understandable to volunteer board members without specialized accounting backgrounds, precisely the kind of safeguard that might have caught this pattern in its first few months, rather than letting it run for nearly 2 years. I remember sitting through my first real finance committee meeting after Callahan's removal, armed with a printed glossary of nonprofit accounting terms Perpetua had put together for me, feeling embarrassed every time I had to stop the conversation to ask what a particular line item actually meant, certain I looked foolish next to the professional consultants and the more experienced board members around the table. O'Dali caught me after that meeting in the parking lot and told me something I've held on to since, that the embarrassment I was was feeling, the discomfort of admitting I didn't understand something and asking anyway, was precisely the muscle none of us had exercised strongly enough during the fund's first 2 years, and that building it now, however uncomfortable, was the actual work of protecting our mother's legacy going forward. I took on a more active board role myself once the rebuilding began, unwilling anymore to simply defer to someone else's professional expertise the way I had, with such costly consequences for the fund's first 2 years. I sat in on every finance committee meeting personally, asked questions I would have once felt embarrassed to ask, insisted on understanding every line item well enough to explain it myself rather than trusting a summary document to tell me everything I needed to know. It was slower, more labor-intensive than the fund's early operation had been under Callahan's confident professional management. It was also, I came to understand, the only version of stewardship that could have actually protected what our mother had built, the version I wished, more than almost anything else that came out of this entire ordeal that I'd practiced from the very beginning. Faustina joined the fund's board eventually, at O'Dali's invitation, bringing her own hard-won expertise in nonprofit governance and her particular informed vigilance about exactly the kind of pattern that had cost her own former organization so much before anyone had caught it clearly enough to act. She told me at her first board meeting that being part of rebuilding something after watching a similar situation go unresolved for years at her old organization felt like its own kind of closure, even though the two situations were, in the end, entirely separate organizations with entirely separate students affected. The scholarship program itself resumed within 8 months of Callahan's removal, funded partly by the restitution payments already flowing in, and partly by a renewed fundraising effort built around full, transparent public disclosure of exactly what had happened and exactly what safeguards the fund had put in place to prevent it from ever happening again. I worried, going into that renewed fundraising effort, that donors would be understandably reluctant to trust an organization that had so recently and so thoroughly failed the basic obligation of actually helping the students it claimed to serve. What I found instead, somewhat to my surprise, was that the transparency itself became a source of renewed trust rather than an obstacle to it. Donors, several of them told me directly, appreciated an organization willing to publicly account for its own failure rather than quietly burying it. And the fund's second launch, in its own strange way, raised more in its first year than the original fund had raised in either of its first 2 years combined. One of the 12 students in that first renewed cohort was a girl named Wilhelmina Suarez, 17, who reminded me in ways I couldn't fully articulate until I'd watched her accept her certificate of the kind of student our mother used to talk about with such specific fierceness. Sharp enough to test into advanced placement chemistry 2 years early, working 20 hours a week at a grocery store to help her family make rent, applying to state universities with a quiet, careful hope that never quite let itself become full expectation. Her mother came up to me afterward in tears and told me she'd almost talked Wilhelmina out of applying for the scholarship at all, worried it was some kind of scam given everything the family had read in the local paper about the fund's earlier troubles, and that she was grateful, more than she had words for, that we'd been transparent enough about what happened to earn back enough trust for her daughter to apply anyway. We held an award ceremony for that first new cohort of scholarship recipients in the same high school gymnasium where our mother had taught for 3 decades, the same room where I'd watched that first genuine ceremony years earlier before any of this had happened. I stood at the podium that evening, in the role Callahan had once held, and told the small crowd of students, families, and community members exactly why the fund had gone quiet for those 2 years, exactly what had happened to the money that should have been theirs, and exactly what our mother would have wanted us to do about it once we understood the truth, which was simply to keep going, to keep insisting that the specific work of noticing which students had talent but lacked opportunity was worth doing correctly, however painful the path back to doing it correctly had turned out to be. The first time I visited Callahan after his sentencing, I sat in my car outside his new apartment building for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself go up, running through, in my head, every version of the conversation we might have, none of which felt like they'd actually match whatever was waiting for me on the other side of that door. He answered looking thinner than I remembered, the specific kind of thinness that comes less from any deliberate choice than from months of stress finally catching up with a body, and he made tea for both of us with hands that weren't quite steady, a small, ordinary domestic gesture that felt, in that particular moment, strangely moving. I visit Callahan now, occasionally, at that same small apartment, a considerable step down from the comfortable life the fund's diverted salary had briefly afforded him. Our conversations are careful, halting, neither of us quite sure yet what an honest relationship between us is supposed to look like after everything that happened. He's working now at a job entirely unrelated to nonprofit management, something administrative and quiet, the kind of work that requires nobody to trust him with anything larger than his own individual tasks. I asked him, on one of those careful visits, whether he thought he could have stopped himself if our mother had lived longer, if she'd been the one running the fund's oversight rather than a volunteer board of former teachers and an inexperienced younger sister too intimidated by his professional expertise to ask hard questions early enough to matter. He thought about that question for a long time before answering, longer than felt comfortable sitting across a small kitchen table from him, and finally said he honestly didn't know, that some part of him suspected he'd have found a way to hide it from her too, eventually, the same careful, professional-sounding explanations that had worked on the rest of us. But another part of him, he said, thought maybe her specific, unteachable instinct for noticing exactly which kids needed help and exactly how much they needed might have extended, somehow, to noticing exactly when her own son had stopped being the person she thought she'd raised. Ferris Duarte, the engineer our mother had quietly helped decades earlier, the one who never knew where his scholarship fee had actually come from, reached out to the fund's public email address a few months after the Rebuilt program's first award ceremony, having seen a local news story about the fraud and the fund's transparent recovery from it. He didn't know, until I called him myself to thank him for reaching out, that the woman who'd quietly paid his summer program fee all those years ago was the same Marisol the fund's name honored. He cried on the phone, the specific, disarmed crying of a grown man encountering, decades later, the full shape of a kindness he'd never fully understood the source of, and he became, within the month, one of the fund's most dedicated new donors, along with, he told me, a standing commitment to mentor a scholarship recipient personally every single year going forward, a way of finally repaying a debt he'd spent 30 years not knowing he owed. I don't know which version of my last answer with Callahan to believe, or whether it even matters anymore which version is true. What I know is that the fund exists now, rebuilt, transparent, careful in ways it never was under either our mother's brief, hopeful oversight or Callahan's confident, ultimately fraudulent management. I know that 12 students received scholarships in the program's first renewed year, more than double what the fund managed in either of its original 2 years combined. I know that our mother's specific, fierce belief that noticing talent without opportunity and doing something concrete about it mattered more than almost anything else a person could do with their limited time, survived everything that happened to try to corrupt it, survived a brother's betrayal and 2 years of quiet diversion, and a criminal case and a difficult, still unresolved relationship between the two of us, because enough people eventually cared enough to look closely at the numbers rather than simply trusting a confident, professional-sounding explanation. I still teach myself, sometimes, small pieces of nonprofit financial literacy on quiet evenings, the same patient, deliberate way our mother once taught herself the college financial aid system well enough to help students navigate it decades before any formal fund existed to do that work at scale. I think, often, about how much of what she actually gave her students wasn't money at all. Not really. It was attention, the specific, unglamorous discipline of noticing a detail closely enough to understand what it actually meant, whether that detail was a placement exam score or a family's quiet financial strain or, years later, a line item in a spreadsheet that didn't add up the way a confident explanation claimed it should. I keep a folder now, the way I've come to understand people who live through situations like mine so often eventually do, with Perpetua's initial findings, Basil's complete forensic audit, Faustina's sworn statement about the earlier pattern, and the final settlement and criminal case documentation, tucked into a drawer in the small home office where I now handle most of my own board responsibilities personally, rather than deferring them to someone else's supposedly superior expertise. I don't open that folder often, but I want it there, the whole record, for the day some future board member, faced with their own confident, professional executive director and their own vague, unexplained gap between fundraising totals and actual mission spending, needs proof that the discomfort of asking uncomfortable questions is always worth the risk of temporarily insulting someone's professional competence, because the alternative, the 2 years our own family lived through without asking those questions early enough, cost real students real opportunities that our mother spent 31 years of her life trying to make sure they'd have.